I am delighted to be with you today in the beginning of this conference, and I am delighted also with the topic of the conference, which is quite close to my heart. So at the moment, I think that the world seems quite a hostile place, especially for the marginalized and the vulnerable. There is a lot of polarization, and people seem to kind of focus on extreme views, extreme opinions, and sometimes even extreme acts. We seem to have lost the empathy that we have for each other and for different communities. And it seems that we have gone to inside inwards, looking inwards at our own identities and at our own claims and at our own visions for the future, rather than allowing to understand better, to know better, and to be more aware of the claims, the histories, the traumas of others. And I think that this can only be fixed with more cultural resources, more understanding of our past and our history, of our own past and history, but also of the people who are around us and people who are further from us, the communities and also the individuals, and more interaction. And in this respect, I think that collections are really important. And we really, I think, have to adopt the cultural rights approach. And if we talked about sustainable development and cultural rights 15, 20 years ago, even 10 years ago, unfortunately, people could not identify what exactly we meant. But I think that now we see more and more that the world understands and appreciates the cultural rights approach. So what do we mean about when we talk about cultural rights? We mean that we need to protect rights that protect the development and expression of cultural identities. At their core, they empower individuals and groups to express their humanity, their worldviews, and the meanings they attribute to their existence and development through various forms of human expressions. So they include a wide variety that are exhibit in collections. They include the ways that collections are being discussed and are being put together. And they include the actual places, so whether they're interactive, whether they allow access and participation to everyone or not. The cultural rights approach is very important, I believe, when we talk about collections and promoting sustainable development, in the sense of first adopting a wide definition of cultures and what we mean by cultures and what we mean by cultural rights. It is not only the exhibit of collections we know now, but it is also the participation, the visions we have, the priorities we have as individuals and as collectivities, and the narratives we have, and these have to be reflected in the collections and the way that collections are put together. When we talk about the cultural rights approach, we talk about participation that at times can be very far-reaching for specific sections of the population. And we finally talk about benefits that these individuals, but also, the artists, etc., but also the collectivities, the groups, indigenous peoples, minorities, etc., will benefit from these collections and from putting up these collections and displaying these collections and working, with the collections. And I think it is very important to say that not all international agencies have understood so far the importance of using the cultural rights approach. I think all international texts have to be interpreted having in mind the cultural rights approach. So having in mind the minimum standards that states have undertaken to respect, which is the cultural rights. I think it is important that already existing texts, for example, UNESCO texts, WIPO texts, etc., are interpreted with in light of the evolving standards of cultural rights. And I think it is also important that we use the soft but existing enforcement avenues we have in order to ensure that states do take measures to ensure that cultural rights are upheld. So how exactly can these be interpreted and applied when it comes to collections? Well, first of all, I don't need to tell you that collections have to be inclusive. In the official visits that I have made, I have specifically talked about how collections are still not inclusive of everyone. I remember very well that this was something that I noticed when I went to Germany on my official visits, especially when it comes to museums and national archives and national museums. So, entities that are very closely related to the state. I think there still exists a very top-down approach. Unfortunately, which goes to my point previously, the justification for this top-down approach, the justification that states give that they maintain this top-down approach is that UNESCO says that the national culture has to be protected. And a lot of states, including the states where I come from, Greece, will tell you that the culture is threatened. And I try to ask, why would the state culture be threatened ever since I remember myself? I really don't think that national cultures are being threatened so much as we say. If anything, I think it is the minority and the cultures of the vulnerable and the marginalized that are being threatened. And we have to ensure that it is these cultural resources and these narratives that are added, that are seen every day in the national museums, in the national archives, in the national libraries, etc. So first of all, I would say that it is really important for real inclusivity, which also comes to real representation. And by real representation, I talk about the interpretations and the narratives that accompany the exhibits. We see very often that these narratives are state narratives, and we try very hard to ensure that this is not the case. For example, very recently, I have a case of a state that I cannot name at the moment still, that in the Biennale decided only to exhibit objects with the state narrative that was quite different to the narratives that other collectivities living in the state have. So this is still very much this, what I said, this top-down approach, and the exclusion of the alternative narratives is very pertinent. So we really have to act on this if we really want to talk about sustainable development. Because when we talk about sustainable development, now we know that we do not only talk about economic development, but we talk about all collectivities and individuals feeling proud of who they are, feeling proud of their past, or understand what were the wrong things that happened in the past. And on the basis of these, they have the vision and they create, and they also evolve their vision for the future. So for this reason, I think that tackling the narratives is essential. And for this reason, I would say that representation is important. Now, there are two issues that I usually see. The first issue is the tokenistic approach. Of course we're representative, because in a board of 21 people, one person is indigenous, one person is woman, one person is a minority, and one person is disabled. But this is not real representation, is it? So we have to ensure that we talk about effective equality, which means that sometimes these voices are going to need to form the prevailing voices. So I have been in states and in museums where indigenous exhibits are being shown in a fantastic way. But then when I ask how many indigenous peoples the experts interacted with, the curators interacted with, what they're going to tell me is that a couple. And I'm thinking, why, when we talk about free, prior, and informed consent of indigenous peoples in all matters that concern them, and when this is now an existing standard, why don't we have the same when it comes to collections? So especially when it comes to collections of indigenous cultural resources, I would now expect that indigenous peoples would have the lead. Some people say to me, well, yes, indigenous peoples in the same way as minorities, in the same way as, you know, other marginalized and vulnerable groups. And I think it is important here to say that this is why cultural rights are important. For example, in this case, cultural rights give priority to the indigenous peoples, more priority than other minorities and other marginalized groups. So when we talk about representation and when we talk about participation, I think it is important, first of all, to ensure that such participation and representation are going to be substantive, and second, and effective. And secondly, to ensure that specific groups have participation in a way that the international community has decided, the level that the international community has decided they need. Another issue is that we have to take into account intersectionality. So an indigenous woman is not going to have the same views and the same understandings of the past and the same stories that an indigenous man from the same reservation will have, or from the same group. And I think that we have to take this into account. And I think this is the only way that we can ensure that real sustainable development is guaranteed. I also think that we really have to ensure that these narratives and these understandings and the actual exhibits are revisited, because cultures are not static. Cultures evolve. And in the same way that minority and indigenous and all cultures evolve, the national cultures evolve. And we have to take that into account. I also think it is very important, especially in the light of the current situation, that we ensure that the exhibits and the way we, and the archives and the books and the amazing cultural resources that collections have, ensure that they don't have a populist core, a populist message. And I think in the current international situation, this is extremely difficult because, of course, collections need to be seen, and museums, archives, libraries need audience, and they need people to come and like them and get passionate about them. And unfortunately, the populist message is one where one can get more passionate than the nuanced messages that sometimes these real narratives, these narratives that represent all dimensions have. So I think that this is very difficult, but I think that we need to be aware and we need to take it into account. So no populist messages. Sustainable development exists. exists to reverse inequalities, stereotypes, and prejudices. And I think collections have responsibility to do this as well, and to change social norms. So at the moment, in addition to populism, I see two more issues that are very difficult for collections and the sustainable development in general. The first one is difficult cases of exhibits from people who we now know have actually violated human rights. They're not the heroes we thought they were, but they were actually the oppressor, the colonizer, the one who encouraged slavery. And I think there, again, black or white and extreme measures do not work well. So I think that collections and collectors have to reflect carefully what would be the best message, not to hide the atrocities and the human rights violations that have happened in the past. So very often, not to hide these exhibits, but maybe to have them somewhere and explain why we are not as enthusiastic as we may have been about these exhibits 20, 30 years ago. The second big challenge that I know a lot of you face is digitalization and AI. And I think that in my report, which comes out in October, in a few days, but also in the digitalization report that I discussed with the United Nations last year and the civil society, I focus on two issues. The first issue is what I said at the beginning, that digitalized copies can never be a substitute for the real copies, for the real exhibits, for the real books. They can only be complementary. And we have to take into account still the divide that exists, the gaps that exist in the world, the narratives that are pushed forward, etc. The second principle is that we have to ensure that these decisions are made by the communities themselves and the source communities and the cultural communities, the cultural sector. And certainly they're not made by big companies whose main aim is to use collections and exhibits for more money. So I think these are the two principles that I find as my guiding principles when it comes to AI and collections. And finally, I want to talk a little bit about the future. So I think I said that the future in Mondiacult, where a lot of us are going to be next week in Barcelona, thank God we will hear a lot finally about cultural rights. And I think this is a fantastic step forward. And I hope, my mandate has made a contribution to this step being taken by states. But what we do need is, first of all, as I said, international bodies to interpret their existing documents and their existing guidance in light of cultural rights. And the second issue is that we need cultural rights or the culture to become part of the post-2030 agenda. The reason why we need this is because we need culture and cultural rights to have targets, to have aims, and to be in the attention of states. The previous time, the Sustainable Development Goals did not have culture as a standalone goal. And the main argument was that, first of all, that culture oppresses, which I hope now, and certainly my mandate, has shown that culture may oppress, but also culture transforms and inspires, and it's essential for each one of us being steady on our feet about who we are, who we have been, and who we want to be. So this argument, I hope, is not taking traction anymore. And the second argument why the culture was not a standalone goal was that it's okay, culture is everywhere, and culture should be mainstreamed in all the development goals. Well, first of all, we've seen practically that this has not happened. In very practical terms, culture was pushed aside. And secondly, gender equality has also to be mainstreamed, but we do have a gender equality as a standalone goal, right? So I think this is a non-argument. It can be both a standalone goal and of course, mainstreamed through the other goals. So this is why we go to Barcelona to convince states and everyone that it is very important to have culture as a standalone goal for real sustainable development that includes our identities and includes evolving our identities in the way we want and in the way that is also conducive for social cohesion and all of us living together. Collections and people who work with collections have a very important role to play in this respect. Thank you very much.